Hi, my name is Tony, and I'm a participant of Google Code in 2010. Today, I'm going to be talking and guiding you through the individual steps of setting up the open source operating system DragonFly BSD. First off, we're going to boot off the DragonFly BSD CD and get to this menu, which has advanced options for booting up DragonFly BSD. There are a few power management related options, such as disabling AHCI or ACPI. You might want to try these if DragonFly doesn't want to boot up, but otherwise you should be fine. You can also choose to select an SMP kernel, which stands for Symmetric Multiprocessing. What this basically means is that it distributes the workload of a process across all the cores of your computer, provided it has more than one core. You can select this option by pressing M at this menu, or stick with the UP uniprocessor kernel if you don't, or if your kernel panics when booting up the SMP kernel. As my virtual machine doesn't agree with SMP, I'll be using the UP kernel. You can press 1 to boot up the default kernel. The grey and bright white text that follows is part of the startup process, which just provides some information about the system and the drivers it's loading. Just sit tight for a while and wait until it stops. Eventually, or hopefully, you'll get to a login prompt like this. As the instructions say, you can use the username installer to start the DragonFly BSD installer, or root to log in as an administrator and explore the system. We're just going to install DragonFly BSD, so typing in installer will do. Now we've reached the DragonFly BSD installer welcome screen. As you can see from the menu, there are options other than installing DragonFly BSD, but these options will require DragonFly BSD to be installed in most cases. Since the purpose of this screencast is to install DragonFly BSD, let's just select Install DragonFly BSD. This is just a warning telling you that the DragonFly BSD installer is not 100% stable just yet, but in most cases, such as with the clean install, it should be fine. Select Install DragonFly BSD again and here's the disk selection menu. If you have multiple hard disks, you might want to check carefully which one you want to install DragonFly BSD on, but here, I'll just be selecting the only one attached, VBox Hard Disk 1.0. This dialog asks if you want to use the entire disk to install DragonFly BSD on, or only a small chunk of it. Currently, if your disk is completely empty and has no partitions on it, you can't use the use part of this option, like in my case. You will need to use fdisk or some other partitioning utility to first create this partition, which I won't be covering here. So let's just go back to disk selection menu, select our disk again, and choose Use Entire Disk. Here's another warning dialog asking if you want to irrevocably erase everything on your selected hard drive. I don't think it's necessary to explain what the cancel option does, so let's just select OK. When you get this dialog, your disk has now been formatted for use with DragonFly BSD. Now we have an option to select what file system you want to use. UFS, or the Unix file system, is the standard old-fashioned file system that other BSDs like FreeBSD, OpenBSD, and NetBSD have used for years. If you want to be able to reliably read and write files on those operating systems, then you should select UFS. However, since version 2.0, DragonFly BSD has support for a file system called Hammer, which supports cool features like history and snapshots of data, no FSC keying required for dirty remounts, and a bunch of other features comparable to Oracle ZFS. However, Hammer is not recommended for file systems less than 50 GB in size. So if your partition is less than 50 GB, you should stick with UFS. Otherwise, if you don't really need to read or write files on other operating systems, like Linux or other Unisys, then you should select Hammer. Even though my disk is only 40 GB, I'll be selecting Hammer for the sake of illustration. Here we have the subpartition creation screen, which lets you customize your subpartition layout in your larger partition. The boot subpartition does not need too much space, and the installer here has smartly given it 768 MB. Depending on your system's memory, you may also need to specify a swap partition, which is what the system will use once you run out of RAM. For a lightweight DragonFly BSD install, you won't need too much. The final subpartition that is added by default is the root subpartition, which contains everything else from user files to programs. You should let this fill up the rest of the partition, unless you want other mount points, such as a separate /home subpartition for user files, or /user subpartition for programs. What you may also notice here, depending on the version of DragonFly BSD you're using, is the option to create encrypted subpartitions. With this option, you'll be prompted for a password in the next screen for unlocking a subpartition when you need to use it. Note that you cannot do this on the /boot subpartition, and this option is unavailable if you're using a DragonFly BSD CD that's version 2.8 or older. This is out of the scope for basic install, so let's just continue. As I mentioned before, here the installer warns us of using Hammer on a file system less than 50 GB. If you get this warning, I strongly recommend that you return to the file system selection screen and select UFS. As you can see here, the UFS file system has a different default subpartition layout given by the DragonFly BSD installer. Unlike Hammer's default configuration, it splits the partition into more individual subpartitions in order to compensate for the inefficiencies of the UFS file system. The subpartition here mounted on / is the core of the DragonFly BSD operating system. It contains only the essential files required to run DragonFly BSD, and as we can see further down the list, the DragonFly BSD installer suggests creating /home and /user partitions. The defaults should be fine to accept, but if you want to do any fine-tuning, feel free to do so here. This process may take a while depending on partition size, so just sit tight and wait for it to complete. Actually install DragonFly BSD to your system. If you've mucked up in the previous screen, feel free to select Return to Create Subpartition and fix up any mistakes. Otherwise, let's get installing. This process will take a while, depending on your computer's speed at reading from a CD and writing to a hard drive. For the sake of brevity and not wanting to bore you, I've skipped past most of this process. The installer is now offering to install a bootloader onto your disk. What this means is that it will write a small boot block at the start of your hard drive, which will inform your computer of where DragonFly BSD is installed and how to boot it up. You shouldn't be overly concerned with the packet mode option, as it's more of a technical issue and should be safe to leave as the default. If you don't have any other operating systems installed, such as Linux or Windows, it should be fine to accept these options. Otherwise, you might want to skip the step and configure your already installed bootloader for that operating system. Congratulations, you now have a fully functional DragonFly BSD system. Setup doesn't end here yet though. You still need to configure your system before you can use it properly. The options in this menu should be relatively self-explanatory, and for a freshly installed system, we should go through all of them. Depending on your computer, your system's clock may or may not be set to UTC. As the screen says, you should select yes if you know it is, or no if you don't. Either option will bring up this list of time zones, which are organized in standard Unix time zone format. I'll just select Pacific, then Auckland, and now we're done configuring our time zone, which brings us back to the system configuration menu. The next option down lets you set the system time and date, in case you already haven't done so in the BIOS. My date and time are all in order, so I'll just go back to the configuration menu. The third option on the list is Set Keyboard Map, which allows you to change how your keyboard is mapped, in case you have a non-QWERTY layout such as Dvorak or some other kind of local keyboard mapping. My keyboard is a standard QWERTY keyboard, so I'll just be returning to the Utilities menu. By default, the root user has no password protection, which I have to say is somewhat akin to having a house with no locks. We should fix that right away. Here's just the standard new password routine, and our root password has now been changed. You might also want to add a user that isn't root for general non-administrative use, to protect yourself from accidentally messing up the system or disallowing a virus access to important system files. I'll just type the details in for my user. And it has now been set up. The next step is setting up networking, which is very important if you want internet access on your DragonFly BSD. This brings up a list of network interfaces installed on your system, most of which aren't actually real Ethernet cards like Faith0 and Elo0. The first one in the list, in my case EM0, is usually the real network interface card you have attached on your computer. You have the option to use DHCP to configure your network card, or manually assign its IP, subnet mask, and so on. I won't explain what DHCP is in this video, but generally speaking, if you have no idea what DHCP is, but you've never manually assigned your IP address, most likely you've been using DHCP all along, so you might as well enable it. If this process fails, then you might want to configure your interfaces manually, which is just a simple fill-in-the-blanks process. Here's the output from ifconfig, which shows the IP address, broadcast, and whatnot obtained via DHCP. You might also want to set your computer's hostname and domain. I'll just set my hostname to Dragonfly, but if you have any hostname or domain name requirements, you should set them here. I will not be going to the set console font or the set screen map options, as generally speaking you will not need to display characters that aren't ASCII on the raw console. Finally, we have the remove software packages option. This menu allows you to select and remove any packages that you don't need from the Dragonfly BSD based system. If you're familiar with Unix system administration, you might want to play around in here. Otherwise, I recommend that you leave this alone. Now we're all done. Just select reboot this computer from the menu, eject any CDs once it shuts down, and then watch your new Dragonfly BSD system boot up after prompted by the press any key to reboot function. If you've mucked up anywhere in configuring your Dragonfly BSD system, you can boot from the live CD and select Configure System again to access the configuration menu. Well, that concludes my screencast of how to install Dragonfly BSD. If you have any further questions, you can contact the wider Dragonfly BSD community via the IRC channel on EFNet, that's #DragonflyBSD on irc.efnet.net, or make use of their mailing lists at www.dragonflybsd.org/mailing lists. That's one word, mailing lists. Thank you for watching and have fun with your new operating system.